Ukraine and Brazil, are they truly worlds apart? Or can a common ground be found? Do they actually see peace differently? The reality is far more complex than just the statements issued by politicians in both countries. In this episode, we look at the heart of Ukraine-Brazil relations, their history, mutual willingness to learn more about one another, and what the future may hold. You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. Explain Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. This episode is part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. In this episode, UkraineWorld's Deputy Chief Editor Anastasiia Herasymchuk spoke with Caio Favaretto from Maranta, Inteligência, Política and Mackenzie Presbyterian University, and Ivan Fechko from the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Inteligência Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a chief editor of UkraineWorld. Before we start, let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast series was created with the support of International Renaissance Foundation. So, let's start.
Caio, Ivan, welcome. Today we are diving into a complex topic, Ukraine-Brazil relations. It's quite a heated topic given the history of Brazil's stance towards Russian aggression against Ukraine, and I hope today we can shed light on the thinking behind these dynamics. So let's start right here. Russia's aggression against Ukraine and Brazil's response to it. Those controversial statements by former Brazil's President Bolsonaro are well remembered. And now Brazil is emphasizing its neutral position and has worked out a kind of a peace plan together with China. So what's really driving Brazil's position on the Russian aggression? And how can Ukraine and Brazil find middle ground here? Caio, let me address this question first to you.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude for the opportunity to be here and all the work that has been done for PEN Ukraine, for Renaissance Foundation, and so many other initiatives bringing together two so distant nations like Ukraine and Brazil. It's a pleasure to be here speaking with you. So first of all, thank you. I believe that to understand the Brazilian position better or in the best way, it would be very helpful to step a few steps back, right? So Brazilian diplomacy has a long, very standing tradition of neutrality concerning international conflicts. I would say that this is the core value of our international approach, at least for the last, I'd say 70 or 80 years. And although some might argue otherwise, I would say that this is still Brazil's perspective. I believe that Brazil's stance remains the same. Our diplomatic leaders have been in contact with both sides, have visited both Russia and Ukraine at least 2 times. I would say that we still align with the main principles of international law applicable in cases of aggression, which is for sure this is the one case, right? So in multiple occasions, Brazil has called the situation an unjustified international aggression and should be treated as such. So from I would say a moral stance, from moral perspective, this is our view, right? I wouldn't say our official view, but our general view of the conflict. This is an international, unjustified aggression. However, we should stress, I think, that we have a very delicate global moment, especially concerning politics and geopolitics, and this is very sensitive, right? Many experts consider today what they have been calling the polycrisis, right? This is a concept that Adam Tooze, a Columbia professor, has been circulating a lot, and this is something that we should bear in mind when we analyze the Ukrainian invasion. We've been living through a climate emergency. We've been living through an arms escalation. We've been living through financial crisis, global supplies tensions, issues around Taiwan, democratic challenges up at most, the rise of far right movements, even I would say even United States and France, which are in fact very consolidated democracies, are faced with very challenging situations nowadays, right? So apart from that, we should not forget the Middle East after the 8th of October. All the situation with Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and not to forget China's rise as a major global player. So especially on political and economic aspects. So this brings a special and layer of complexity to the global scenario. In Brazilian's perspective, especially, we've been dealing with the Venezuela case and very complex situation with other republics in South America and in Latin America, such as Mexico, Colombia. So this is a very global, highly complex scenario. So I think that the invasion of Ukraine should be analyzed and read under this umbrella of this broader context. Right? We're facing a deep crisis on multilateral system. The mechanisms, the classical mechanisms of UN, they used to aim or try to aim and regulate conflicts have been especially ineffective in the recent years, especially in the last, I would say, 3 years or 4 years. So Brazil has always supported these multilateral systems, and there's no coincidence that we open the UN General Assembly each year. So we are very deep believers of this system. Brazil has sought, in its own way, to organize efforts to facilitate dialogues among central players in this conflict. This is my personal point of view. And the plan put forward by China and Brazil represents somehow this effort to start to give a kickoff of what would be, I think, in the best scenario, the best way to put together the demands and the claims of all the players involved in the table. Right? This hasn't been done so far. I would say that neutrality or a recognition of quote unquote both sides have their claims is not at all the Brazilian perspective. I would say that we are trying to approach very pragmatic way to this massive and very costly conflict, especially from the Ukrainian perspective. And this should stop as soon as possible, right? So this is from my point of view, this is the humanitarian Brazilian perspective so far. But I'm here very open to discussion. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, before maybe diving deeper into discussions on the essence of Brazil's vision of possible peace, let's take a look at the Ukrainian position on Brazil's stance. Like, what were Ukrainian expectations on Brazil's reactions? Were there any expectations? And how does Ukraine perceive the Brazil's intermediary position in this war? Ivan, let me address this question to you.
Yes, thank you, Anastasia. Thank you, Caio, for this very interesting expert review of Brazil's position. And I would like really to begin briefly with a historical perspective from our Ukrainian perspective of our relationship that brought us here. And I think that we have to study these historical lessons. First of all, we can say that Ukrainian and Brazil relations have evolved significantly over the past 30 years, passing through distinct stages. Initially, there was a phase of acquaintances or introduction characterized by mutual respect and the strengthening of bilateral political and economical contacts. These periods of close cooperation in areas of shared interest and culminated in the declaration of a strategic partnership within the first 15 years. However, the early 2000 tense, broad disappointment, followed by a gradual cooling of relations between 2014 and 2018. Reflecting on these historical lessons is crucial, allowing us to better understand our foreign relations and recognize previous mistakes. And I think it is worth noting that the dynamics of the first years of cooperation decreased due to the other foreign policy priorities of both countries and domestic political problems that diverted attention. And it must be admitted that Ukraine for its part, paid insufficient attention to Latin America in general and Brazil in particular until 2022 in the context of determining its foreign policy priorities. In 2014, with the beginning of the Russian aggression and occupation of Crimea, we expected the support of Brazil, which traditionally had a position regarding the condemnation of forced methods in resolving interstate relations. However, the real shock was the vote for the resolution of the UN General Assembly on the territorial integrity of Ukraine when Brazil abstained. That negative impressions remained after the former president of Brazil, Bolsonaro, visited Moscow on the eve of Ukraine's full-scale invasion of Russia at a time when the whole world was watching the tension on the border. Of course, such actions were taken as support for Putin, especially since Bolsonaro refused to visit Kiev for balance. And after the invasion, Bolsonaro, as we remember, refused to condemn openly Russian aggression, although indeed officially Brazil supported the UN resolution. Therefore, there were hopes that the situation would change for the better with the election of Lula da Silva, but from the very beginning we heard comments unacceptable for Ukraine and later proposals for a mediating role in the format of equalizing the aggressor and the victim of aggression. In particular, the so-called well-known Chinese-Brazilian peace plan, which firstly was not discussed with Ukrainian authorities, which violated the principle of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, and secondly, some points play in favor of Russia, and thirdly, it creates competition in the implementation of the Ukrainian peace formula. So Brazil's position in the context of Russian aggression, from our point of view, against Ukraine reflects several factors. Historically, on the one hand, Brazil had sought a neutral stance in conflicts between major powers to avoid choosing sides and instead prioritize its economic and strategic interest. And also partly due to Brazil's role in BRICS, where Russia has significant influence and it's ambitious to foster a multipolar world or independent of US dominance. But also it's very important and not should be excluded about the Russian influence, which take its root from the types of the Soviet Union, having inherited large diplomatic missions and also large resources began to be directed to the region since the beginning of Putin's rule at the beginning of the century, and a special activation since 2014 with an emphasis on propaganda against Ukraine. This influence includes the activities of the propaganda network of mass media like Sputnik or Russia Today, and the activities of cultural diplomacy institutions, bribery of officials, and espionage by the diplomatic staff. And to find middle ground, I guess Ukraine could emphasize mutual benefits and Brazil's opportunity to solidify its global image by supporting a peaceful, rules-based international system. This approach can resonate with Brazil's support for international law and UN principles. Framing it is an investment in Brazil's credibility as a global leader. Increased dialogue and trade partnership could also appeal to Brazil. And it is important, the final thing, to remember that a country that supports the reform of the UN Security Council, like Ukraine also, and claims the place of a permanent member of the Security Council cannot ignore the violation of UN principles and be a partner of a war criminal for whom an arrest warrant has been issued by the International Criminal Court.
From the points you've just mentioned, I would like to focus on actually the Brazil-Russia relations. I mean, in terms of quite tight contacts between Brazil and Russia, and taking into account this peace plan proposed by Brazil and China, like And again, taking into account, Caio, that you told that Brazil is sticks to the norms of international law and in violation of these norms, like, can we say that the Brazilian contacts with Russia could actually make a certain influence on the negotiation positions of Russia? Like, could we assume, like as experts, that Russia would heed, or at least to be attentive to Brazilian opinion on the whole scope of this problem? And actually, why? It's just a very simple question: why Brazil is interested in its cooperation with Russia, taking into account that this country is a grave violator of international law?
Thank you for the question and for Ivan's contribution. You've brought very important issues and aspects of the conflict. I wouldn't say, and this is I speak for myself here. I believe that I wouldn't call Brazil cooperating with Russia strictly. I would say that Brazil has aimed to reach China as maybe the country that will have the final word on how Russia is conducting the war, having in mind that China has become, in fact, some, I would call it a war chest of Russia. I mean, this is something that we should take into account when we evaluate, I would say, the effects of the sanction politics and all the exclusion of Russia from the main financial system. And I'm not saying here that I agree or I do not, but I would say that maybe we have unforeseen consequences of strengthening, in fact, the relation between, especially China and Russia, on conceiving and more complex, more resilient back channel financial system, right? So this is and I deeply believe that Brazil should be one of the many countries that have been trying to remain neutral and try not to split the world into two different systems. Right? This is something that I deeply believe, and I think that Indonesia, Qatar, Singapore, they have in their own ways trying to be the countries that should be connecting and not splitting countries and systems, and the global as a whole, and the globe as a whole. So I wouldn't call it a cooperation, even if, and I'll spend on that a bit. Brazil has more than 100 years of diplomatic relations with Russia, and this is something that really challenges the relations between Ukraine and Brazil, right? This is something that I can expand a bit on the cultural ties and how should we could bring Brazil and Ukraine closer, and this is something that Brazil is deeply interested in. But this is just explaining how I see I would say the cooperation between Brazil and China to bring all the heavy players to the table. And I believe that the first, even if we have very complex and not consensual points in the Brazilian and China proposal, this is something that we should bring to the table with the peace formula proposed by Ukraine, so that we can get to the common ground, right? I really don't think, and this again is my personal perspective, that this conflict, seeing all the complexities that I've mentioned before, will be resolved within the old multilateral system, such as UN, unfortunately. So I really think that we should aim at the pragmatic approach and bring all the relevant actors to the table, even if they do not stand with the, I would say, the Occidental multilateral institutional system, right? And here I do quote Celso Amorim, which is the top advisor, Lula's top advisor on international relations, and he usually quotes Nelson Mandela when he says, "Well, if you want to talk peace, you have to bring your enemies to the table." And I deeply believe that, as painful as it sounds. This is it.
Well, following up this complicated war related issue we've just discussed, I'd like to shift to something more conceptual about the bilateral relations. Ivan mentioned, while answering the question, I mentioned the long history, complicated but long history of Ukraine-Brazil relations, and also mentioned the word strategic. So here, I would like to ask, what is the real nature of our bilateral relations, and what way does the word strategic really carry here? And can we actually find ways to understand each other's worldviews?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, really, Ukraine-Brazil relations really has very big potential, and as you mentioned before, that we had strategic level officially, yeah, bilateral relations. But I think the main problem is that the understanding of the essence of the strategic partnership and that mentioned agreement between the countries is different, and the conditions of the period when it was signed in 2009 were also different, because in-depth cooperation in the space sphere during the first administration of President Lula da Silva defined relations of a strategic nature between our states, which was confirmed during the visit of the Brazil president to Ukraine in December 2009. It was then that the joint declaration of the president was signed, and which declared a strategic partnership between the states. However, for the Brazilian side, the idea of strategic partnership is a kind of valve designed to reduce tensions in relations with the other stronger international partners. And in Brazilian foreign policy thinking, this practice has been used, as we see, since the 1970s, when in the conditions of the Cold War, they looked for an alternative to relations with the USA and found it in the deepening of strategic cooperation with European countries. In fact, the appeal to the idea of strategic partnership presupposes for the Brazilian diplomatic establishment the conscious presence of some kind of global confrontation. And in order not to fall into its trap and choose a side, Brazil resorts to the idea of strategic partnership with third countries, like with Ukraine, for example, and in practice, for the Brazilian ruling elites, the concept of strategic equals important with regard to political or economical benefits. And the list of such strategic partners of Brazil is quite long. And of course, unfortunately, I think it's clear that the failure of the main project in bilateral relations, like it was happened with this space project, with the decision of Brazil to cancel the space project, caused a great loss for the strategic nature of the relationship. And for Ukraine, since 2014, in the conditions of an existential war against the Russian invasion, attracting support in countering this aggression is a key factor in strategic partnership with other countries. And according to the 2021 foreign policy strategy, Brazil is one of 13 strategic partner states and the only one from Latin America. So yeah, Ukrainian government prioritized this state. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves that and we have to admit that now in our relations, the relations do not correspond to the status of strategic nature. Let's take a look at the main parameters of strategic partnership, which should be used to assess the real state of Ukraine's relations with any South American country. First of all, the volume of mutual trade, the presence of joint, second of all, the presence of joint major projects, and finally, strong culture cooperation. Now, all these directions are very weak, and during the so-called golden age of mutual cooperation, it was before the crisis of 2008, the trade turnover between the countries reached $1 billion. Now we have the much worse situation. And however, the relationship has cooled considerably at the moment, which indicates the need to restart it based on the success of the past years, and it is also worth noting that there is no strategic partnership agreement, joint strategic level body, and free trade agreement between the countries, and all this indicates the need to review relations between the countries with the aim of restarting them and finding direction for long-term cooperation that will be beneficial to both countries. And a few words about, as you mentioned, about this idea of Brazil mediation in this conflict, as Ukrainian government stated that Ukraine would be really great if Brazil helped to stop this war, but it's very important that this initiative should be really from the position of UN Charter, and we can't let freeze this conflict again, as it was with Minsk, for example, when Russia took some years to prepare themselves to start again new aggression. So any possible negotiation should consider this and should not repeat this problem from the previous years. And it's very important to avoid such a condition, because now what we see like peace initiative from China and Brazil, it looks more like just freeze the conflict and then decide what to do. But of course, it's not the exit for us, not the final idea, because we can't let Russia legitimize this occupation of south of east part of Ukraine and take a time to have new aggression in future. So that's why it's so important, and I think we should cooperate in Brazil in political way to show this position, especially considering that Russian aggression against Ukraine not only destabilize situation in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. For example, we already mentioned today about this difficult situation in Venezuela and the tension between Venezuela and Guyana, and of course when one dictatorship and Russia, how Russia started this war without any punishment from international society, it could be like a temptation to start its own war, for example, even in such a different region.
Caio, what would be the Brazil's view on this, and what steps might be taken to make this cooperation really strategic, and maybe what are the practical spheres of interest for mutual cooperation?
Sure. I'll say that in a world, as we've mentioned, of so many crises, I'd say that strategic tends to take the meaning of something concerning conflict and competition, and the world is increasingly being colonized by both concepts, right? Conflict and competition. And I would say that my immediate answer is that all aspects of international relations are becoming strategic, right? But however, I would say that conflict isn't something we desire. We are indeed becoming. I think that to think of strategic relations should aim, in fact, on diffusing tensions and fostering peace. And I should say that Brazil has very successfully lived in peace with its neighbors for the last 100 years. So this is something that really Brazil could contribute in globally, right? But having said that, I would say that the climate crisis for Brazil is one, if not the biggest challenge we face, and this is something that we see every day in the news. The last days, Spain has been deeply affected by a major flood with almost 100 people dead. I could spend another whole podcast naming climate tragedies all over the globe: China, United States, Africa. We could be speaking about tornadoes, famine, floods, droughts. The list is very long and very sad. But this is something that really pops up the importance of strategic relations. Addressing climate change, I'd say it's the biggest task of mutual global cooperation. And I would say that Brazil and Ukraine, especially, well positioned to address this challenge. And this is something that I consider strategic in the strong sense of the word. I would say that enhancing economic cooperation, pursuing common political principles, promoting scientific knowledge, fighting disinformation, as Ivan really well mentioned, fighting disinformation, fighting the bad consequences of AI, right? Deepening democracies. This is strategic for me today. So I'd say that humanity faces high stake challenges, and we've mentioned that the arms race, the technological advancements of international intelligence, and this is something that should foster and be the common ground of the cooperation between um, Brazil and Ukraine. So um, I had the opportunity to visit Ukraine in February last year, and something that really popped up from in the minds of everyone that were with me during the 2 weeks that we spent in Ukraine is that we have the importance of nature-related assets in both countries are amazing, and this is something that I believe that should guide the relation between the two countries. Brazil's upcoming months will have very important geopolitical leadership. We're talking about the G20, the BRICS Plus, who will be presided by Brazil next year, as Ivan well mentioned, the COP30 next year. This is something that really grabbed Brazil's attention and will be very important to us during the next few months or years. I'd say that the links between climate, natural resources, food security, minerals, energy, these are the main topics that we should be paying attention to. I'd say there's a mounting pressure on rethinking international cooperation system based on those main themes, right? The climate-based debates are advancing independently from the multilateral systems. These multilateral systems, I think, have not been able to address this agenda properly. So I really think that bilateral relations will be especially important between, again, Brazil and Ukraine. So this is something that really caught our attention, and we've mentioned this sort of motto, "United by nature." Right, nature should be something that we really would bring Brazil and Ukraine closer. Um, I'd say these are one of the main. I'll put my bets on that. Right, we're talking about biofuels. We're talking about forest preservation. We are talking about big data concerning endangered species. We're talking about AI and very sophisticated engineering and satellite technologies. Um, Technology exchange between the two countries. I'll think that these are the main strategic agendas that should bring Ukraine and Brazil closer.
You've mentioned various rooms for cooperation between Brazil and Ukraine, like we mentioned the global level and global challenges, political dimension, and also practical spheres of cooperation. But you, Caio, mentioned the necessity for both nations getting closer to each other. And you've also mentioned your visit to Ukraine and your impressions of that. And it made me actually to focus and to think about another important dimension we haven't mentioned yet. It's the people to people dimension. So could we say that people to people relations and knowing each other better for societies of both countries could help build stronger mutual understanding? And can we describe the general perception of Brazilian society by Ukrainians and Ukrainian society by Brazilians? Do we have big gaps in this understanding of each other? And here, I would also like to mention about the Ukrainian diaspora in Brazil, which is quite numerous. And there is this very common misconception of like the Soviet legacy in relations with Brazil. And actually, to be fair here, like Ukrainian specialists, in fact, took part in the industrial cooperation with Brazil. So even if we talk about the Soviet Union, it was actually not so much about Russia, but mainly about Ukraine. So if we talk about this diaspora's contribution of Ukrainians to Brazil, and also about Brazilians coming to Ukraine or living to Ukraine, like what is it all about, and how to make us understand each other better? Caio, let's start with you.
Thank you. And this is a very, very good question, very important. And I'll be brutally honest here. While there's a general tendency in Brazilian society to condemn Russia's invasion and Russia's aggression, and again, it should be taken as such, I still feel that most people see the conflict as a far off conflict involving countries that we know very little about. I would bet that many couldn't even point these countries on the map. And this is really, again, being brutally honest. So the lack of awareness, the common knowledge, the cultural ties, this is an issue, right? And compare it to Russia, as Ivan well mentioned before, there's a gap, right? There's a gap, and this reflects some lack of lack of attention. Maybe this is not the best expression, but something that revolves around that concerning Latin America. And comparing to Russia, the cultural presence in Brazil, there's a difference, right? The Brazilian, even if they have the general Brazilian, even if they don't know, they don't have deep knowledge about Russia, there's still a general stereotype of what Russia is, what its history, what is its culture, and this makes a difference. Just as an example, I'd say that Brazil has maintained diplomatic relations with Russia for over a century, including during periods with very deep political turmoil during our military dictatorship. We had the persecution of communists or leftists or socialists, students and labor unions. People were killed and tortured. And even in that time, Russia's position was to maintain diplomatic relations. And I'm not here evaluating or judging this decision, but I'm saying that the ties are old and deep, right? And this is something that challenges um, or put some difficulties on strengthening also Brazilian and Ukraine ties. So this is something that should be addressed, right? This is what it's given from the start. This should not be ignored, right? But I'm generally very optimistic on the no, of the few on the future of Brazil and Ukraine relations, right? Um, I'd say there's a very, very large field to deepening cultural and economic ties, as I've mentioned, music, art, contemporary art. I have been very happy to contribute a little with something that started last year, which is an exchange program between the São Paulo Philharmonic Orchestra and the Ukrainian Institute. We have been exchanging musicians who spent some time in Brazil, sometime in Ukraine, Ukrainian musicians in Brazil, Brazilian musicians in Ukraine, and I think that this is something that should be named at. The day-to-day living, to know the food, to know the music, to know the poetry, to know the art. This is something that makes changes the perspective on creating common ground, on creating general knowledge about a country, and this is something that enacts and to give a human face to the conflict, right? I have friends with ties to Ukraine, and I should say, from my personal point of view, that this is something that really motivated me to go to a country in war, right? To spend a week doing meetings and going to shelters with my friends and my professional colleagues. This is a challenge, but I think that a lawyer working on human rights issues and a former philosophy teacher, this is something that I had the obligation to face, because I should know the face of war, what it looks like, what it is to be living in a country in war, and what would be the human aspect of the conflict. And this is something that only comes up when you really know people, when you really know culture, when you really know poetry, when you really know music, right? Yeah, it gives again a human face to the conflict. And as you asked concerning the Ukrainian presence in Brazil, Brazil has a very vocal, very influential Jewish descent community. um, I really think that this is the Jewish diaspora. It's enormous, and Brazil has a very again large and vocal Jewish community. In fact, the biggest public university, University of São Paulo, has the name of the library, the main library, is José Medlin, which was a Jewish born in Odessa, and one of the most famous book collectors in Brazil. And our library were named after him. This is very specific ties, but that should be worked upon. This is how I believe that both countries should come together. As you mentioned too, we had a more recent um, Ukrainian diaspora in the south of Brazil. It's a rural community, but as far as I know, they speak Ukrainian up to today. So very important.
Well, Ivan, what is Ukrainian view on this?
Yes, I totally agree with you and Caio that cooperation with civil society and think tanks, human rights groups, academics, etc., is really important, especially in this context. And I remember last year in the summer there was some kind of opinion poll, and it revealed that 67% of Brazilians favor their government supporting Ukraine and countering Russian aggression, and it's even higher than in countries like Germany or France in Europe. Yeah, and I think that this situation demonstrates that despite powerful Russian propaganda or disinformation, as well as internal problems in Brazil, society in general has a favorable attitude towards Ukraine and understand, maybe, I guess, this struggle, and this opens field for work for cooperation. And of course, it was a year ago, and we understand that people in different countries have different problems, and they may forget sometimes about what happened in other countries. That's why we should always cooperate in this direction, and it's very important to establish cooperation with academic community, scientists of various fields, to have different exchange program, to open Ukrainian studies program in Brazil, which I think contribute to the spread of knowledge about Ukraine, history, culture, and in general, the role of public, in particular culture diplomacy, is very important. For example, the Ukrainian Institute, a leading institution for the promotion of Ukrainian culture abroad, chose Brazil as one of the three areas of its activity in the Latin American region. Exhibition, festivals, translation of Ukrainian books are small but very important steps for long-lasting friendship. And of course, I can't forget about diaspora. As a researcher writing PhD thesis on the Ukrainian diaspora in Brazil, I can say that the Ukrainian community plays a very significant role in improving relation between Ukraine and Brazil. It's really one of the largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world, more than 500,000 Brazilian with Ukrainian roots, and the history is great. It's more than 130 years, but and during this time they managed to preserve their identity, language perfectly integrated into Brazilian society. So it's not only Ukrainians, but of course Brazilians too, and conducting events in support of Ukraine, supporting Ukrainian culture, communicating with local and national politicians. Ukrainian Brazilians are of great importance to us and have already become a bridge between our states. And as excellent example of this, we can mention about the role of the diaspora or in the recognition by the Brazilian Senate of the Holodomor of 30 years, the largest artificial famine created by the Soviet Union in Ukraine as a genocide of the Ukrainian people. But at the same time, I think it's important to say that the full potential of the diaspora has not been used. So it's important for the Ukrainian government also to establish some systematic work with diaspora to work and to continue this cooperation. And finally, I think we cannot forget about the Brazilian volunteer soldiers who voluntarily flew halfway from around the world and joined the Ukrainian army to fight against Russian aggression. This once again confirms the common values that the Ukrainian and Brazilian people actually share. If you put politics aside, values of democracy, freedom, sovereignty of nations, I think that despite all the challenges we have, we need to continue to build relations on this foundation and work with civil society. It's really an important step to this.
Thank you. Does any of you have anything to add, because we are getting closer to the wrapping up this episode?
I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity. I really believe that Brazil and Ukraine have shared values. We have a shared future, and I believe that we should, and we are indeed deepening ties, and the peace, the condition of having a global, the humanity survival, especially facing human crisis, famine, depends on Brazil's and Ukraine cooperation, especially concerned that we are the bread and basket of the world. In fact, we've been having the same role of providing cheap natural resources to the planet for the last 200 years at least, and this has been maybe a curse to both our countries, and we have lived through that in different ways. But I really think that trying to become this, or to turn this into a blessing, really depends on the cooperation between the two countries. So I deeply believe that Brazil and Ukraine should come closer and closer together from the cultural aspect, the economic aspect, the human rights perspective as well. So I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity for having this discussion here.
Thank you. Caio, Ivan, thank you so much for this insightful conversation, and thank you for joining.
This was a podcast Explain Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual media about Ukraine. This episode is a part of a joint series, Ukraine's Global Partnerships, produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the war zones at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This podcast series was created with the support of the International Renaissance Foundation. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.